From the start of the COVID-19 outbreak, President Donald Trump of the United States has dismissed scientific and medical advice and warnings and sidelines or even fires those who disagrees with him. What are the dangers to undermine the role of scientific expertise? To discuss that and more, I'm joined by Professor Chen again from East China Normal University, and also Zoon Ahmed, our friend, also research fellow from Tsinghua University. Zoon, I want to start with you. You know, Trump announced on Monday that he's taking an unproven drug called hydroxychloroquine to fend off COVID-19, despite warnings from the medical and scientific community. What messages is he, the President of the United States, sending to a nation that is battling the coronavirus?
Wang, firstly, thank you for having me. You know, this entire politics over the pandemic has become, unfortunately, the focal point. Specifically talking about President Trump's defiance against the scientific community, not only globally, but within the United States, I think partially his decision to endorse a drug that has not been endorsed by the scientific community has to do with in a sense, you know, discrediting the claims of the scientific community itself. But the implications of his decisions and his rhetoric in the recent weeks, actually, it has more of a negative impact on the polarization within the United States. You yourself have lived in the U.S. for many years. Most of my family is over there. And I think people over there that are suffering the impact of COVID-19 feel pretty much abandoned. Because the problem is that because of such mixed messaging and signaling against what the recommendation of the scientific community is, the impact of that is that the frontliners have to suffer more. They have to deal with more cases, and this is something that China did incredibly well. And there is an increasing polarization within the United States. And the other issue, which I would like to point out personally, is that there was also some different treatment of states that are currently Democratic versus those that are Republican. So there are some domestic issues within the United States that are becoming increasingly exposed because of the experience of COVID-19. And I think the worst part is that it's nobody else suffering more American people because of this. The U.S. right now boasts, unfortunately, about 30% of all COVID-19 cases worldwide, and this number seems to be increasing. There is mixed attitude towards how to deal with the pandemic, how to deal with the virus domestically as well. And I guess the end point is just who to blame for the situation that they face domestically. And clearly, we all know that right now, the Trump administration has chosen their scapegoat, which is Beijing, which is China. So it's a very unfortunate situation.
Yeah,
indeed.
Zoon, you know what? Do you think with President Trump's presidential power, his power to veto bills, to issue executive orders, to demonize the mainstream media, and also to, you know, popularize a narrative through his tweets? You know, he has 70, 80 million Twitter followers last time I checked. Do you think there could be any meaningful checks and balances to President Trump's tendency to let politics prevail over science right now?
You know, Wang, the problem is that to a great extent, I think globally people are questioning how a government should function. What is the trade-off between personal freedoms versus safety of society at large? There are many new questions that are coming up because of the experience of COVID-19. This is something unprecedented in recent decades, to say the least. So I think the problem is not, the presidential system, the political system of the United States has its own shortcomings. But the real issue comes where the president is able to tweet, and he has this charismatic persona for millions of people in the United States. So what he says becomes word written on stone. And the problem is when people take to the streets because they feel that they need to fight for their right for freedoms, personal freedoms, devoid of consequences for society at large. And I think that is the real question that needs to be debated. I know that a lot of people think that, okay, the scientific community should have a say in what the country decides, especially in issues that have consequences, drastic consequences, such as COVID-19. But on the one hand, we know that governments had to deal with the trade-off between economy and safety. So this was a difficult decision to make for governments all over the world. But the problem with the United States right now is that they had let the problem fester to such an extent that now, even if on some level they resort to scientific solutions, which the presidency is not resorting to yet, at the end of the day, they need to maintain popular support. And that is the requirement of the system. And how do they do that if they take complete blame for where the people stand today? These are tough questions that people across the United States and to some extent across the world are having to answer. It's a complex and unfortunate situation for the people on the ground who are suffering consequences.
Sure, no doubt. I want to turn to you, Professor Chen, in Shanghai. What do you make of President Donald Trump's dismissive attitudes and words, behaviors towards science, firing those who disagrees with him, sidelining them? How much does it have to do with the electoral politics? Because this is an election year in the U.S. And how much does it have to do, in your opinion, with President Trump's personality?
Yeah, I think actually there are several, levels in our perception of President Trump's very peculiar way of dealing with the pandemic. I think on one hand, actually, we are looking at a kind of anti-intellectualism, a kind of, deep, suspicion of truth, common sense, and also science, in his way of talking about injecting disinfectants into the human body to kill the virus. That was obviously a kind of, farcical, laughing stock, for the world. On one hand, that is definitely, something that is quite, ridiculous. On the other hand, obviously, we're looking at a failed leadership. He has been constantly firing his own medical staff, his own medical team, also threatening to fire more. This is a kind of like a team in the White House that lacks, consistency in the policy, also in the understanding of the mechanism, and also in the strategy of tackling with the disease. I think actually this is very dangerous and has the potentiality of a worsening scenario that is still brewing and also developing in the United States. The United States is obviously the strongest country in the world. It has got the strongest economy, strongest science and technology capacity. But such a country in such a kind of situation is actually losing control of the pandemic. Looking at the scenario in America, that's 85,000 fatalities, and also on an average daily basis, 20,000 people are actually dying every day. This is actually definitely not what actually America should be, experiencing. So I think actually this is definitely a failed government demonstrating its incompetence and also lack of proper measures to look at the issues. Definitely, I think actually you're right. That's I think electoral concerns are actually at the root of that. Actually, there's no long-term understanding or perception about the situation. Actually, what actually is preoccupying Mr. Trump's mind is only about his re-election. That is to ensure his poll results.
But Professor Chen, do you think that will really help with his re-election? I mean, the anti-intellectualism that you've talked about, anti-common sense in a way, do you think that will really resonate well with his voter base?
I think actually it will only cause, yes, I think it will only cause a backlash. It will only boomerang to hurt him, because he's talking, for example, about restarting the economy, reopening the economy. But obviously, at this situation, when the American situation is still, hasn't reached the peak yet, the curve is obviously still rising. So definitely there might be, prospects of a worsening, deteriorating situation. So at the end of the day, the economy will only, start to go downwards. And also the situation of the disease control will also be slipping away, from, out of the administration's hand. So I think actually it is also damaging his own, re-election prospects, and also the American economy, and also the health situation in America.
Well, Zoon, in Beijing, do you agree that the politicization, blame game surrounding COVID-19 launched by President Trump will be damaging to his re-election prospects, as Professor Chen just said.
I agree with Professor Chen, but I think I want to provide a context. We all remember that when the policy of lockdown of Hubei was announced in China, there was increasing criticism about this policy, as if China had done something inhumane to its own people. In retrospect, we know that China has been the most successful country as far as combating COVID-19 is concerned. Now, the question for President Trump was, in retrospect, if we think about it, that he wanted minimum damage to the economy and because of the virus. And I think this was a conscious decision that needed to be taken. Many governments, it's not just the United States, but many other governments were trying to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on people. And this backfired. We saw what happened in Italy. We saw what happened in various other countries, Iran, France, the UK today. And the United States, President Trump also tried. I mean, this is sort of wishful thinking, going against the recommendations of the scientific community, going against successful cases of combating COVID-19 simply because you were in a position to criticize them. So it is an unfortunate backlash. I do agree to the extent that the gains are short-sighted. What President Trump was thinking about was the election in November. He was thinking about short-term perceptions of the people and the electorate, and this essentially has resulted in the situation where they stand today. So what he needs is a scapegoat. What any president in his position with the decisions that he had made would need is someone else to blame. Because the reality is that they managed the situation in the poorest way possible. And that has resulted in an unprecedented unemployment crisis, an unprecedented death toll, and really figures that were not perceivable, that were not predictable. An example here is that, for instance, we saw that.
I do hope that cooler heads will prevail, because we're talking about the most devastating pandemic since World War II. And that's all the time we have. Many thanks to our guests, Professor Chen Hong and also Zoon Ahmed from Tsinghua University. That is this edition of The Point. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Download CGTN app to watch our show. I'm Wang Wen in Beijing, sitting in for Lucy.